On November 26, 2002, President George W. Bush signed Linda Reade's certificate, and she became a United States District Court judge. She hit the ground running, and she's been running at warp speed ever since. She never, ever applies the brakes. She's the hardest worker I have ever met. She's a double D graduate of Drake with an undergraduate degree in biology, which I did not know. And she graduated from Drake Law School with high honors and Order of the Coif. She also has a master's degree in higher education administration from Iowa State University. She's really done it all. She was in private practice for 6 years. She worked with Ray Rosenberg, who's since deceased, but most of the older Des Moines lawyers knew Ray. He was one of the finest trial lawyers ever to be in Iowa. Did a lot of criminal defense work, but did civil work as well. In 1986, Linda joined the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District, just across the street. And not too long after that, she became chief of the criminal division. And then, I believe it was 1993, she was appointed an Iowa District Court judge here in Polk County. So, how many in the room have known Linda Reade on a personal level, not just appearing before her, for at least 15 years? Raise your hand. Okay, keep your hands up if it's 20 years. Keep your hands up if it's 25. Keep your hands up if it's 30. Keep your hands up if it's 35. Keep your hands up if it's 40. Okay, how about 45? Anybody at 45? Well, I'm going to raise my hand because I've known Linda Reade for 45 years. And I actually knew her before she went to law school. And I'm one of many of her friends who encouraged her to go to law school. And I'm so glad she accepted the encouragement and went to law school. So Linda and I have a standing joke that we laugh about. And the joke goes something like this. Lawyers think two things about our relationship. One, that we don't like each other, and two, that we don't get along at all. And I can understand why that is. I mean, after all, we have the identical politics, the same judicial philosophy, the same sentencing philosophy. We are so much alike that we just clash all the time. So Linda and I understand why people think that, but nothing could be further from the truth. In the 45 years I've known Linda Reade, we have never once, not once, exchanged a crossword. And in the 15 years we've been colleagues, I started off as chief judge, and then for 10 years, Linda was chief judge. If we had a disagreement, I can't remember what it was. It had to have been exceedingly minor. We've agreed on virtually everything. She is just an incredible colleague. And so I just want to list a few things about Linda that are so meaningful to me. There's a great quote from the Irish literary genius Oscar Wilde. True friends stab you in the front. True friends stab you in the front. And that epitomizes Linda Reade. And what I mean by that is she's the least duplicitous person on the planet. In other words, when she tells you something, you know she told somebody else exactly the same thing. She never varies in what she tells somebody. She's 100% honest and truthful. I said she's the hardest worker I've ever seen, and that's true. She has always put the interests of the Northern District of Iowa ahead of her own interests. She's always taken more than her fair share of the load, and never once in the 15 years we've been colleagues has she ever once complained about how hard she works. She never asks more of others than she's willing to give of herself. And her leadership is one of the most fascinating aspects of her personality. She is extremely collegial. She seeks the advice of others. But when she makes a decision, she is decisive. and it doesn't take her a long time to make decisions. And she makes them in good faith, and they're always the right decision. And so she's just been an unbelievable chief judge, and Chief Judge Strand is now following in the same footsteps. A couple of things about Linda: she never lets anything slip through the cracks, and I think the rest of us do. And she just shows super initiative compared to other judges in the country. So, for example, when the crack cocaine guidelines were retroactive, and we had something like 600 or 700 resentencings, Linda took charge of that. She wanted to make sure everybody that was entitled to a reduction got one. She wasn't satisfied with just the list from the Department of Justice or the Sentencing Commission. She had our United States probation officers triple check it to make sure nobody was denied a benefit they were entitled to. And under her leadership, we got our cases done before many districts even began to start theirs. And we had, in terms of absolute numbers, the third highest number of defendants to resentence in the country. She never ever shies away from tough decisions, no matter how unpopular they may be. So I adore Linda Reade. I don't know how else to say it. If you like could come up with a hypothetical judicial colleague, it would be Linda Ray Reade. I mean, I just couldn't have asked for a better colleague. And so I'll just close by saying, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, the privilege of working with Judge Reade probably ranks number one in my professional life of the blessings that I've had. She means that much to me. She's just an incredible human being, and she's just an unbelievable colleague. And even though I took senior status before she did, when she told me she was taking senior status, I cried. Thank you, Linda Reade.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Just a brief introduction on the format. It's a little different this year. I'm Fran Haas. I'm from the Nymaster Law Firm, and I'm on the Federal Practice Committee. And over here is Tim Vavracek, who is an assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Iowa. Tim and I are former law clerks of Judge Reade, and so we are going to be conducting kind of an interview of Judge Reade to hear what she has to say. So that's a change in the format. And you know, Judge Reade, as you heard in Judge Bennett's wonderful introduction, she's had a lot of really interesting positions in the legal profession in Iowa. And so she has a great perspective on how the practice of law has changed or not. And so we're going to be asking her some questions about that. And we went ahead and asked some people who had worked with Judge Reade or, you know, had appeared in front of her to get some of their stories, so those are woven into the questions we'll be asking.
Judge Bennett mentioned you're a proud graduate of the Drake Law School, and a number of folks we talked to mentioned that you had worked for the dean of the law school prior to matriculating. Why did you decide to go to law school?
Well, I took a position at Drake Law School. At one point in my career, I wanted to be a dean of women, you know, a bun on the head. We used to have those. Those of you who are older will remember deans of men and deans of women. And I had a number of administrative positions, and I applied to work for John Scarlett, who was the dean of the Drake Law School, as his administrative assistant. I wasn't a typist. I was to run the law school basically in his absence, doing the administrative types of things that needed to be done. Turns out I started a friendship with some of the professors there that you'll all remember. One of my close friends, T.J. McDonough, Larry Pope, Bob Hunter, Father Petz,
and we would go to coffee, and of course I had a science background, and they would start talking about their cases, and I got very, very interested, and I had tuition benefits. I could take one class a semester free, and I decided to take a law school class, and then the bug bit me. I didn't have enough money to go to law school, so I took a part-time load, and then my last 2 years I was a full-time student. I had to take out some loans and get my money together, but that's how it all happened. Nothing in my life has been planned. I have had opportunities, and I've taken advantage of opportunities. There's no life plan for me.
Judge Bennett also mentioned working for the late, great Ray Rosenberg. How did your expectations about your legal career when you were a law student measure up to your first years of practice?
Well, I think in those days, most people who went to law school thought they wanted to be a trial lawyer, and I was not an exception to that. And I had the opportunity to clerk for Ray when I was a law student. And I guess that I started to realize then, and as I fulfilled my first year out of school, how very little I knew, and that the book learning was just fine, but as a practical matter, there were a lot of other things that I had to learn. And one thing about Ray, and I could talk about him forever, but his strength as a lawyer was he knew human nature. And as I look at the profession now, and many of our friends out there have been in the practice, have been true trial lawyers in their careers, they have strength because they know human nature. They know what juries are going to believe and what jurors are not going to believe. And Ray had a knack for human behavior that was exhibited and which he taught to me, and I think that carried me through my professional career.
Now, fast forward 15 years, and you now preside in one of the busiest courts in the country. For those who may drive by the Cedar Rapids courthouse and not see a line of people outside, can you tell them just how busy it is?
Well, for many years, and Judge Bennett, this was during the Bennett-Reade years when we were the only two district court judges. We had senior judges. For many years, we were number one in the country in the number of trials per judge, excepting maybe the 5 border courts. And that has really been the history of the Northern District of Iowa. At times, we have been so busy that I have tried 2 cases at one time. I'd try a criminal case from 8:30 in the morning to 2:30, take a half an hour break, get a new court reporter and a new law clerk, start in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a civil case and go till 8 o'clock at night. Judge Bennett and I were always busy and always willing to help each other, but our court points are so far apart that you're really on your own, and so sometimes you have to do some kind of drastic scheduling to make everything work.
Previously, you were a district judge here in Polk County. How is the caseload in federal court different from the days in Polk County?
Well, I look fondly at my Polk County days as a state court judge, and I miss my colleagues there very much. I'm very sad when I read in the paper and I talk to former colleagues about the condition of the state bench and the disadvantages they're working under. No money, no help, In the old days in Polk County, we had a court reporter and a judicial assistant, and they were very helpful in kind of managing the caseload. And of course, in the old days, you had to go down to the file room and get these paper files that were about this high. Now, of course, in the federal court, I have 3 law clerks. I have a judicial assistant secretary. There's electronic filing, and so I can be anywhere in the world and do my work. I don't have to deal with all those paper files. But as far as the work is concerned, the federal courts are more specialized. The courts in the state system obviously are a more general court, and therefore you could get any kind of case imaginable. I remember one family law case where they were fighting over a dog named the Red Baron. And I don't quite get those kinds of things, but it is interesting. When I first went to the federal bench, I got a Hague Convention case about a custody and a custody of a child who had been brought into the United States from a foreign country, and the parents were fighting over it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I thought I left that behind. And I was really disappointed. I thought the next thing they would do is bring me a juvenile law case, which would have totally blown my mind. The state bench has an advantage, and that is that there are a lot of judges. So if you have 2 cases set for the same day, the court administrator would find another judge. In the federal system, you do your own case management, your own scheduling. If you've got 2 cases, you have to figure it out. And so you don't have the backup as a federal judge that you have as a state court judge. I'm hoping that there's more funding for the state courts because they have a hard job and they do not have the help they need to do that job. And as a result, I think you're going to find fewer practitioners who are really even interested in going to the state bench, which I think is a real tragedy for our legal system.
Do you have any examples of how practice, not just federal practice, has changed since you first became a judge in Polk County?
Well, I think the biggest change perhaps that I have seen is the advent of electronic filing and all of the ramifications from that, in that you have you no longer have the typing on Selectric typewriters, which I can still see Ray's secretary Sharon typing, if you can believe it, briefs for the 8th Circuit with carbon paper, page by page, and if she made a mistake, it was horrible because you had to take all the copies and correct all of those. That, of course, has changed the landscape for practicing lawyers. In the old days, you had to take everything to the courthouse manually. And so when I was in practice, I was the lowest on the totem pole. I'm the one who made that trip. And can I just tell a funny story?
Absolutely.
Well, here's what happened. Ray did a lot of First Amendment work, and we defended a porno bookstore, among others. And we had a case in federal court, and there were a lot of glossy porno magazines. And I had been given the task of writing this brief. But I first had to run a document down to the Polk County Courthouse, and then I was going to go home. So I gathered up all my things, including these porno magazines, and put them in one of those brown packets. And I started down to the courthouse. Well, they were doing some work on Grand Avenue, and so there was kind of a ramp. And as I approached the ramp, there was a woman in a wheelchair. and she was really struggling. So I was going to help her, and I asked her, would she put this packet in her lap, because I had to kind of lift her chair up over this ramp. Well, as I was doing that, you know what happened. The porno magazines went just all over the street, and there was a construction worker directing traffic. Of course, he became my new best friend. But the woman was so horrified that I was gathering up my papers, and then I was going to continue to help her, and she just asked me to. So now I forgot what the question was.
Examples of how practice have changed since you become a judge.
Well, I think that we are losing a lot of interaction between the judges and the practicing bar. I don't see lawyers like I did in Polk County. Of course, maybe that's good and bad for all of you, but used to have a lot of traffic, a lot of interpersonal interactions with members of the bar. They'd stop by if they were in the courthouse filing things and just say hi or have coffee, and nobody was really concerned about ex parte communications. It was just, hey, how you doing, what's going on, that sort of thing. I think lawyer advertising has changed the dynamics, and not for the better. It used to be in the old days, and you guys that are my age remember, you got clients because you did a good job, and it was word of mouth, and you didn't have lawyers on TV touting their own abilities, and as a result, I think the public was better served because they had perhaps a more realistic idea of the qualifications of the lawyers that they were hiring. I also think lawyer advertising takes us from a profession to just being a business. And as we all know, business ethics are different from the ethical responsibilities that we have when we are members of the bar. I don't think lawyers get along as well as they used to, probably because you don't have that interaction that used to take place at the courthouse when you were delivering papers and you'd run into a colleague and you might even pull over and talk about a case that you had. Everything's by email, by IM. You just have lost the fun part and the productive part, I think, by those limitations on personal interactions.
Judge, I think most of us here remember the great flood of 2008 in Cedar Rapids. But what some might be surprised to hear is that was the second time you were actually flooded out of that courthouse. So I was wondering if you might share a little bit about all the water that's been following you around.
And Tim reminded me one time that of the number of places that he served as my law clerk, because we kept getting flooded out or moved out during his tenure with me. The first flood was in 101 First Avenue at the old courthouse. I was in the middle of a jury trial in the old courtroom, and it was the Good Friday, and I came in at 7 o'clock and went into the courtroom, and it was flooded. There was standing water in the courtroom, which really made me angry because I ruined a really good pair of shoes. But it turned out that GSA had decided to re-roof that building, which was a good idea, except they hired a guy that did not understand that we have severe thunderstorms in Iowa in the spring and summer. And he didn't cover the roof. And we had just a real downpour, and it flooded the courtroom. And the ceiling tiles fell down. And the reason I ruined my shoes was because I had rather an interesting confrontation with the contractor. In fact, the marshals left the room. They were horrified at my confrontation. I remember it.
And then there was the second flood, the big flood. And one of the memories we received is from Paul DeYoung, who's now the deputy clerk of court. And he said that he remembered, in anticipation of the flood in 2008, all the court did was move a couple of boxes off the bottom shelves in the basement. And just wondered if you could reflect on the adequacy of those preparations.
Well, I'm responsible for that in part because the clerk of court, Rob Phelps, kept saying to me, we're losing the battle in the basement. The water's coming in. And we took on water in that basement almost nonstop during the years we were there. And I said, yeah. And he said, then he came to me and on a Wednesday and he said, I think we should give the employees the rest of the week off because the crest is going to be on Friday, and the streets are going to be probably blocked off. And I said, you know what? Federal employees need to come to work. And he said, well, they can work at home. And I said, I have a vision of federal employees in their PJs and their hair in rollers, nobody wears their hair in rollers anymore, working on federal work. And that is not who I am, and that is not federal court. But he convinced me. So we did allow them to go home on Thursday. And I said to Rob, and then you call me and you let me know what the situation is. Well, Friday it crested at 31 feet above flood stage, and nobody could go to work. So that was Friday, and by Monday morning I was at our new location, which was out on C Street over by Hines, if you're familiar with our community. And I was in a warehouse that was so filthy dirty and had no offices. It was just like a big, like a warehouse. Had some bays. The only security that we had was a bicycle chain on the front door. The court security officers' weapons were in the old courthouse, and the National Guard and the police were in charge of that. And as I walked in, to make matters worse, they hired a cleaning crew, and they were all standing around talking on their phones, and I just had to chill pill. I was pretty agitated. And Rob came and said, Judge, this is where we're going to be. These are our temporary quarters, and by the way, we're sharing these quarters with the United States Marshals Service, the United States Attorney's Office, the Bankruptcy Court, all the court personnel from our court as well as bankruptcy, with United States Probation. And so we all moved in together in this quite small warehouse. We had bingo tables and folding chairs, and we stayed there for 4.5 years. Now, over that 4.5 years, we did some build-outs to make 2 pretty decent courtrooms, but that took over a year. In the beginning, we held court. We were in court less than 10 days after the crest. I think Judge Scholes had a hearing about the 23rd. I tried a lot of cases and did a lot of hearings in a very small conference room with no security. If I had jurors, they were on bleachers, on folding chairs. Sometimes they had to wear their winter coats and gloves. It was so cold in there. I sat at a little table like this, and behind me I did the bench conferences next to the pop machine, and sometimes that was difficult because it's kind of noisy. That pop machine made a lot of noise. Somebody reminded me of doing a bench conference next to the pop machine when I was out here this morning, and brought back a lot of fond memories. And then Judge Bennett and I had to decide, what are we going to do? Are we going to try to go back to our courthouse? And that was a difficult decision, and people didn't necessarily agree. But we decided to stick it out in temporary space, hoping we'd get funding for our new courthouse, which had been on the funding block. And thanks to Senator Grassley and Senator Harkin, we got the money. But we ended up being in temporary space for 4.5 years, and I don't think I made a lot of friends with that decision either. But you know, but here was the great part, and people that were there remember this. We had such camaraderie because we were all in the same boat. And we had picnics out in the lawn. This is kind of a rural area. And I bought a barbecuer for my law clerks so that at lunch they could go out and barbecue. It was really kind of a laid-back, non-federal atmosphere. And Tim got in trouble with his co-office mate because he wanted to play funky music. And I mean, you know, we were just all there together trying to get along. We did a lot of good work.
You mentioned the new courthouse, which is gorgeous. One of the people I've talked to was Brad Thomason from Ryan Companies, and Ryan Companies was the builder. And I don't know if Mr. Thomason was project manager or the architect, but he said that I needed to be sure to ask you to talk about something called the Stone Wars. He said that, and I have a feeling Judge Bennett said earlier that there were only exceedingly minor disagreements, but I think this may have been more than exceedingly minor.
Well, it wasn't between Judge Bennett and I, but all the judges participated in the planning of this courthouse, and our architects and builders were extremely patient with us. And we had to make a lot of decisions, not only on layout, but on materials. One of the chief issues was, what kind of stone are we going to have on those big expansive walls outside the courtrooms? Everybody had a different idea. So we ended up with Brad doing a sample of all the different stones everybody wanted. Somebody wanted, one of the judges wanted stones from Jerusalem. Well, with the uncertainties of that, the builder was very concerned that the stone would get caught somewhere between Jerusalem and Iowa. Some of us felt strongly that it should be local materials. At one point, I have a picture of this. Judge Bennett and I at the stone quarry in Dubuque in a raging snowstorm. Judge Bennett, of course, had no coat on, you know. And he never wears a coat. He never wears a coat. And there we were looking at the stone and making decisions. Well, the Eighth Circuit judges, they had an opinion. Judge Scholes had an opinion. Judge Jarvie had an opinion. Judge Bennett and I had an opinion. So that conflict became known as the Stone Wars. But as it turned out, Judge Bennett and I won, as usual, and we were able to persuade the architects and the builder that we wanted an Iowa product, so we got Iowa stone.
Going back to the differences between state and federal court, would you please share your experiences with the judicial selection process in each system?
Well, as you know, in the state system, there's a merit panel, and there are, the governor appoints them, and then there are elected lawyers to that. Usually the senior judge in that judicial district in the state system ran the panel. And I thought very much, probably because I wasn't selected the first time, that there was some benefit of having tried many times. And after there was a selection process, and 2 or 3 names were selected to go to the governor. Then you'd go to the governor and he would interview you. Joy Corning, may she rest in peace, the lieutenant governor, was at my interview with the governor. And then the governor usually took about 30 days and then made the selection. The federal system is not that easy, and it varies from administration to administration. When I went through in February of 2002, and my commission was signed November 26th of 2002, which now would be pretty rapid. I was interviewed by 3 lawyers who knew me quite well from practice in Polk County. They suggested to Senator Grassley that my name be included with one of 3 or 4, and then I was invited to the White House to interview, to the West Wing, and I had been there before because I was a nominee for the 8th Circuit as well with Judge Malloy, and obviously Judge Malloy was selected. So then I went through the interview process in the West Wing. Well, Alberto Gonzalez was in the White House as the president's lawyer, and I had an opportunity to meet with him. And we were talking away, and as many of you know, I've been married multiple times. I'm not going to disclose today how many times. But Alberto Gonzalez said, well, you know, are you married? Because I wasn't at the time, and he's looking at my paperwork. And I said, no, I'm not married. He said, well, have you ever been married? I said, well, yes, I have. He said, well, did your husband die? No, I'm divorced. He said, well, was there anything about your divorce that the president would be concerned about? And I said, which one? And that was a showstopper. Fortunately, the phone rang, and it was the president, or the president's people wanted him upstairs, so he didn't get to ask the follow-up question. And by the time his staffers came in, they hadn't heard the banter between he and I, so I escaped. But of course, after the White House interview, your background is done. They talk to everybody who's ever laid eyes on you. They talk to childhood friends of mine back in South Dakota. The FBI does their work, and then you have a formal nomination by the president, and then you appear before the Senate Judiciary Committee for oral questions and sometimes written questions. And then you kind of wonder if you're ever going to make it to the Senate calendar. I made it one midnight, I don't even remember what day. And then the president was on a trip, and he didn't have my commission to sign for about a week or 10 days. And I had taken leave of absence from Polk County to move up to the Northern District, and I was getting pretty nervous, and then finally he came back to Washington and signed my commission, and I was ready to go.
What was it like to be a new judge in Polk County and then a new judge in the Northern District?
It was pretty scary. I remember my first day at Polk County. I was unaware of some of the state law because I had been a federal prosecutor for about 7 years. And so when I got to Polk County, I was pretty new to state law, particularly civil law. There's a lot of carryover in the criminal arena, and I had a lot of work to do. When I got to Cedar Rapids after the commission was signed, I walked into chambers and I had honestly 50 sentencings to do. I had over a dozen cases that needed to be tried, and I had a list of outstanding civil and criminal motions, hundreds of them. and that was because Judge Malloy had gone to the Eighth Circuit, and the delay in replacing him had caused the work to pile up. Judge Bennett had called on every friend he could think of to come and help, and the clerk of court tried to give them kind of the easy stuff. So when I got to federal court, I think, well, Kate Jones is out in the audience. She was my very first law clerk. I don't think we even saw each other for a year, just trying to work through the backlog and get caught up and putting some sense into what we had.
We're almost to time, so I'm hoping you'd be willing to share one more story. And this is my favorite Judge Reade story. And it arises out of the time when you were brand new to practice and you went to a cattle call hearing in state court.
Well, I was telling David Brown this reminiscence. We had a judge in Polk County, very beloved judge, and there was a huge hearing. Multiple lawyers, probably 20, 30 lawyers, came to this hearing, and to facilitate the court reporter's record and the judges, the judge from the bench asked each and every one of us to come forward and sign our names so they could tell who had been there. I was the only woman, and as the men went forward and signed their name, Judge, hi, hi. When I got up there, the judge looked over and he said, "And you can put your phone number down." And I know in this day and age, I know I hear your groans, but it was absolutely hysterical. The lawyers in the room just broke up, and it was meant in the best of good faith. There was nothing untoward about it. And that was I guess if you want to go through your life looking to be offended, so be it. I did not, and I found it very humorous.
Well, we are at time, so thank you very much, Judge.